So we're still in our first unit looking at metaphysics and epistemology. And today we're going to look at a very interesting thinker who has some pretty strange views. But as we'll see, you might not think that they are so strange if you accept some of the fundamental premises that we looked at when we investigated Locke's philosophy. Today we're looking at Bishop George Berkeley, who, well, he was an Anglican bishop, an Irish thinker, and he's somebody who has greatly influenced not only European philosophy, but also American philosophy, and those idealists who came after him. Berkeley was one of the first Romantic thinkers in the European tradition. If y'all recall, when I kind of traced the history of Western philosophy, I talked about all these different periods in European history, right? Well, we started off by talking about ancient and medieval philosophy, which is characterized by religiosity, right? And a very religious view of the world. Over time, that kind of evolved from looking at things through a polytheistic lens to a monotheistic lens after the emergence, rise, and popularization of Christianity in Europe. Medieval philosophy then was heavily influenced by the Judeo-Christian tradition. But society doesn't remain stagnant. Ideas don't remain stagnant. They evolve. They change over time as people think about them, as they wrestle with these problems for themselves. After the Renaissance, there was a turn, we could say, in how European intellectuals and thinkers at the time viewed themselves and the world around them. They started leaning more heavily on reason, right, and rational analysis. This would come to a head in the scientific revolution when this view of reason and its importance in human life obtained a really solid grip on European intellectualism. And what we got from the scientific revolution was explosions of knowledge in all these different fields, the emergence of all these new fields, due to the application of the scientific method and rational inquiry. I characterized the Enlightenment in one of our previous lectures as a time or a movement, you could say, in European history in which, again, reason took prominence and thinkers were trying to wrestle with some of these fundamental questions of the nature of reality, of God, of our place in the cosmos, using the light of reason, which they thought illuminated the world around them, if we're going to continue with that light imagery. Thus, the Enlightenment was heavily characterized by this scientific disposition, this scientific outlook, and kind of a transformation from taking things merely on the basis of faith towards actual conscious, intentional reflection and analysis of all the stuff that is around us. So I tried to impress upon you last time that this Enlightenment period, which affected the politics, the social views, the scientific views, and the intellectual views of these thinkers, was heavily steeped in this thing called reason, in rational analysis. Well, like I stipulated before, there weren't a lot of thinkers who were on board completely with this. Okay? After the Enlightenment, we have the Romantic period, which is kind of a reaction to the Enlightenment. These Romantic thinkers thought that while reason and science is good and useful, it can't explain everything in human life, and it's not the most important thing in human life either. some of the stuff that really makes our lives significant, meaningful, doesn't have a basis in reason and cannot be completely rationalized, such as human relationships, the experience that you have when you look at a sunset, that access that you get to the divine and spirituality through art and music and literature. In some sense, these romantic thinkers argued that this stuff is ineffable. It can't be explained just through scientific or rational analysis. The real stuff of human life that should take priority is, well, developing a certain heart posture towards existence and leaning into feeling and emotion and passion in the humanities. Berkeley is one of the first romantic thinkers during this period who's writing in response to some of the ideas, views, and values of the Enlightenment. In his works, what we see is a critical analysis of these Enlightenment ideas and ideals and the place of that reason should have in human life. And in this piece particularly, we're going to see him criticize some of these fundamental Enlightenment views. See, during this time as well, due to the rise of Newtonian science and the trust that people were putting in scientific enterprise to explain the world around them and develop all of this technology that was transforming human life, a certain view of God and the universe became popular. A lot of these Enlightenment thinkers were still Christian, but again, they didn't want to take things just as a matter of faith. They wanted to explore this stuff using reason, and they thought that science could explain the natural world that God has created. In any case, this view of God, the grand watchmaker view, became popular. This concept of God basically goes as follows. The universe is kind of like one giant clock or one giant machine that works according to certain natural laws, and there's a certain order to it. Things don't happen randomly. And God is basically the one who built this clock, who put it together, this universe with all its laws and its principles and things. And so God wound the clock up at the beginning, and he's just kind of letting it play out, and he's just watching things. Berkeley didn't like this view. He didn't like how this view that was becoming popular was reducing the idea of God to this passive observer of the universe. Instead, he thought that God actually played a very important and active role in what happens around us and why things are the way that they are. So, what we're going to see in the piece that we're looking at today is him, at least implicitly, criticizing this view, this grand watchmaker view. And this view that went along with it, which is a mechanistic view of the universe, that basically all of the physical and chemical and biological processes that you see and experience going on around you are just, well, mechanical in nature. They just follow certain laws, and they're deterministic, and they're just going along doing their thing. What is really important about Berkeley, though, and why we're looking at him in this class, is because the piece that I asked you to read specifically criticizes a lot of the views that Locke had and argued for in an essay concerning human understanding. Berkeley, like Locke, is an empiricist. He's going to say that yes, our knowledge of the world comes to us through experience, through our ideas. So he's going to agree with Locke on his epistemology, or at least parts of it. But he doesn't think that Locke goes far enough. He doesn't think that Locke really takes empiricism to its logical conclusion. And that's what he tries to do in this essay. What we see also is a critical analysis of Locke's view of the universe and how knowledge formation works. Recall Locke's view, right? There are objects out there in reality existing independently of us. If we close our eyes, they're still there. If we leave the room, they're still there. These objects, like tables and chairs and atoms and mugs, they have some certain objective properties, objective characteristics. And the makeup of those objects cause us to have certain ideas about them. So our ideas are mental representations of what's out there. Thus, Locke basically commits himself to a dualistic view of the universe. There is a thing called matter, and that makes up all these physical things like tables and chairs. And then there are minds, spirits, God, mental things that are different in kind from this physical stuff. So all these objects that exist outside of our minds are made up of matter. They cause us to have certain ideas of them. And it's through these ideas that we come to understand the world and be able to move within it and make stuff and achieve some sort of mastery over it. Berkeley disagrees with some of these fundamental aspects of Locke's view. And that's what we're going to discuss today. I'm going to start by explaining to you one of the fundamental disagreements that Berkeley has with Locke's commonsensical view of reality. And more particularly, Locke's distinction between primary and secondary qualities. Do you all remember what this distinction is? Can somebody explain it? Yeah, Kelly?
Wasn't it like the primary was like the shape and like the actual form of something, and the secondary was the like color and texture?
Yeah, and what are qualities? Do you remember? Yeah?
The power of things to produce an idea in the mind.
Right. So qualities, objects, Locke argues, seem to have these powers to produce ideas in our minds. And he makes a distinction between what he calls primary qualities and secondary qualities. Primary qualities are those powers or properties that the object has in itself. So things like whether or not the object is in motion is literally a part of the object itself. It's a property of the object. Or what its shape is. Or how many of the thing there is there. Right? There's one table here, and that oneness is like a property of the thing in and of itself, regardless of what our opinions or beliefs are. There's objectively one table here. Doesn't matter if you're drunk and you're seeing double. There's one table here. Okay? So there are primary qualities. And primary qualities are in the objects themselves. But then there are secondary qualities. Things like color, sound, taste. These are not in the objects themselves. They're formed somehow out of the interaction of our unique minds with these things, these objects that exist independently of us. So the color of a thing, Locke would say, is not in the table. We talked about the physics of color last time, and I tried to convince you of this, that even though this looks beige, the beigeness is not a part of the table, like its shape is, or its number. If you know how light works, you know that when you look at this, you see beige because certain wavelengths of light are reflecting off the surface into your eyes. So you're only seeing a part of the light that is being reflected off this thing, and that's how and why you perceive the color that you do. Similarly, the taste of a thing is not in the thing itself. How do we know this? Well, to some people, cilantro tastes like soap, and other people love it. If it was actually in the object itself, wouldn't we all have the same taste of it? Just like when we look at this, we see the same shape, or we all know there's just one table here. So Locke makes this distinction between primary and secondary qualities, and he thinks that this helps explain our differences in perception. When maybe you see a different color or something tastes differently to you, or you like a piece of music and your friend doesn't. It's because it's not actually in the thing itself. Yes?
Could you explain it as primary is fact and secondary is opinion?
Kinda. Yeah, you could use that if that image helps. Yeah. We could say these are objective, the primary qualities, and these are subjective. Does that terminology help? Now this makes pretty good sense, right? If you're following Locke here, you're like, yeah, okay, there are certain properties that an object has in and of itself, but sometimes, well, maybe the majority of the time, your idea of a thing is not a complete, perfect picture of the thing, right? So yeah, okay, maybe there are primary and secondary qualities. Berkeley is going to disagree with this. He's going to say, we have no actual basis for making this distinction. And we can't prove that there are objective properties in an object, that there are primary qualities. Why? Well, think about empiricism again. This idea that we obtain knowledge of the world around us through experience given to us through our ideas. Can you ever completely know what an object is like in itself? What it really is like? You might be thinking, well, Professor Gunnar, yes. But really dig into that. Reflect on that. If the empiricist picture is true, that should cause you to think all we actually have access to is our ideas of things. Yeah? Because our ideas are like the vehicle, right, for our perceptions of the world. So Berkeley's going to say this distinction between primary and secondary qualities, this is like an abstraction. It's a logical leap. This is a logical leap that we cannot make. Why? He's going to say all qualities are relative to the perceiver. And let me try to motivate that for you here in a second. If you know anything about physics, contemporary science, you might see the truth in this just from the get-go. According to our best scientific theories, is the motion of a thing objective or relative?
Objective.
You think so?
I hope.
Yeah.
I think that depends on how you're describing motion.
Okay, say more.
If you're saying something is like accelerating at a certain speed,
Okay, yeah.
or stuff like that, I think that's objective. But if you're like, oh, it's going forward or backward or something like that,
Then it's subjective?
yeah.
your perception of motion, our best scientists think, is relative because it depends on your frame of reference. If you're moving at the speed of light, everything around you will appear to be standing still, even though it's not. If you're going faster than a car that's driving right next to you, it's really fast, that a car might not even look like it's moving at all. What science has figured out is that motion, for example, is relative to your frame of reference. If you and I are both walking along at the same speed, let's say, and we're in a white room and you can't make out any other objects, it would look, if we're just looking at eye level, that we're both still. So there we go. Locke thought that motion was a part of the object itself. But no, we know according to science that whether or not something looks like it's in motion to you is relative to your frame of reference. For example, you're on this spinning Earth. You don't perceive that the Earth is spinning or moving through the solar system because you're on it and you're moving with it. Right? You don't perceive the Earth in motion right now. Okay, so we have to toss out motion. What about number? If you've ever been really drunk or high, you may have thought you saw multiple of something, right? You're like, oh God, there are 2 tables here. I got to slow down. So it would also seem like how many of a thing that you perceive is also relative on your mental state and your condition. So it would also seem that number is relative to your frame of reference, your subjectivity.
I was just wondering, so like, how could an object, well, I don't know, this is but how could an object be plural? Like, how could there be more than one?
It kind of depends on your level of analysis, right? So, I mean, we say this is one table because we perceive one table. An object can't be plural, right? But we know that this table is made up of a multiplicity of atoms, right? We call this collection of atoms a table, but really there are billions, trillions of things here, right? I don't know. Does that help a little bit? Berkeley thinks this idea that we can't make a firm distinction between these things falls out of empiricism. Because what empiricism tells us is the way that we learn about what the world is like and how it works is through our ideas. All we have access to at the end of the day are our ideas. And we just take it as a matter of faith that they represent things out there in the world independently of us. Just as the taste of something would be different between you and your friend, whether something is in motion, or how many things are there, or what the shape of a thing is also relative to who you are and how you're looking at it. If I tip the table like this, Locke would say the shape of this thing is objective. If I tip the table like this, you see kind of like a square, right? But if I tip it like this, what shape do you see now? Like a rectangle, right? So he says all qualities are relative to the perceiver. It depends on where you're standing, how you're looking at it, what your mind is like. That's something he thinks Locke didn't take into account. Locke, he thinks, just has this faith that our ideas, our mental representations of things, actually give us a good picture of what's out there. So that's the first thing. That's a logical leap, Berkeley says. We don't have a justifiable reason for thinking that there are objects with objective properties and that our ideas are accurate reflections of them. And if you like Descartes' philosophy, you would come to this conclusion too. Because Descartes, he also questions the existence of objects at the beginning of the meditations, right? Because he's like, oh my goodness, I can't trust the senses, right? They've deceived me in the past. So why would I think they're actually cluing me in to how all this works and what it's like? Another way of putting this is we cannot stand outside of our own minds and ascertain reality. All of what we know and perceive is filtered through the mind. Your perceptions and understanding of the world is filtered through your unique mind and lens. And building off of this idea, Berkeley is going to take us in a very strange direction. Since all we have access to is our perception of things, we cannot know for certain that our perceptions of things are accurate representations of what's out there. So, are you following along so far? Is this making sense? You might not agree with it, but you following along? So this is one thing that he's going to disagree with Locke on. But there are many more things we still have to get through today as well. Another aspect of Berkeley's philosophy is what we would call nominalism. This was a view that became popular, I believe, during the medieval period, and it deals with a fundamental metaphysical question. One way of asking that question is, are the things in reality all unique in their own thing? Or is there some kind of essence or concept of a thing that all the tables participate in, and that's what makes them a table? That all the shirts participate in, and that's what makes them a shirt? Is there like an essence or a concept of these things? Another way of asking this is, how do we make sense of particulars and universals? There's another philosophy jargony word for you. See, because in Locke's philosophy, as in Plato's philosophy, which we got into a little bit when we read the Allegory of the Cave, they think that there are these things called universals. The reason why this is a table is because it participates in the essence of tableness, or the concept of tableness, something like that. And when we see something out in the wild, we know it's a table because it has the essence of a table. It has the properties that I think make up a table, that define a table. If you take empiricism, though, to its logical conclusion, it doesn't seem like this makes sense, though. Why? Because all we have access to is our ideas and perceptions of things. And every single one of our perceptions and our ideas are unique. Have you ever had the experience that you're having right now? The same exact experience? No. After a short amount of time, you're going to have a different experience, and a different experience, and a different idea, and a different perception. It's like a stream of perceptions and ideas are flowing through you, and none of them are completely the same. Right? They're all slightly different based on where you are, where you're standing, how you're feeling, what you're thinking, all of this stuff. So when we use words like table or chair or blinds or mug, really all that is just a name that we've attached to all our unique experiences of these things. That word table or that word chair, it's just a name. There isn't like an essence of tableness that makes this a table. And we can see the essence, and that's how we know it's a table. No, everything that we interact with in life, we have a unique experience and a unique idea of it. So, Berkeley is going to hold a nominalist view. Nominalism is the view that universals, or general ideas, we might say, are mere names that don't correspond to anything in reality. Think of table. Tell me, what does the form or essence of a table look like? Or think of another general idea, humanity. What does humanity look like? Have you experienced humanity? Have you seen tableness? Have you seen clockness? Have you felt musicness, the essence of music? No, you've just had all these differing experiences with things that we call tables and clocks and music. Something that we skipped over in Locke is his view that we do have access to general ideas, essences of things. But Berkeley is going to say these words that we use, we've never actually had an experience with these general ideas. They're just mental abstractions that we've kind of made up. And we just use a word to communicate that to other people. You haven't experienced the idea of humanity. That's an abstract, logical concept. It's not, humanity is not in the world. Just like tableness is not in the world. Does this make sense? This is kind of weird, right? It's a weird view, but it's one that has become very popular throughout the history of philosophy. We could have categorized the world differently. We could have used different names for things. We could have defined things differently. In some sense, the names and the linguistic terms that we use, and by invoking these abstract ideas, they're just mental constructions or social constructions. Another way of putting this is only particular things exist. This particular table, that particular table, this particular marker. There's no such thing as the essence of marker that exists in our reality. It's just an idea that we made up to help us talk about it. So, another way of putting this is only particular things exist. There's that table, this marker, those blinds. Why does Berkeley think this? Well, again, he thinks this because every perception that we have is unique. And it's about a particular thing. You have a particular unique perception of this table by looking at this table. You're going to have a particular unique perception of this table when you look at this table. So every sense datum, every piece of sense data is particular. It's unique. And thus, really, what our ideas are, what your idea of that table is, or your idea of that bag, or your idea of that chair, is it's just a bundle of sensations. It's just a bundle of perceptions. When you look at this, you see mahogany, smooth, rectangle. Those are all just particular sensations grouped together in your mind. They come together. They come as a package, and that's what you see when you look at that. This is what Berkeley thinks we come to realize if we really understand what empiricism says and what it implies. Everything that he's telling us so far. And then he does something really unique. He blows up our world a little bit. How many of y'all subscribe to this view that Locke had? This commonsensical picture of reality. There are objects existing independently of us, made of matter, that cause us to have certain ideas. That's how we know reality. Raise your hand. It's probably what you're conditioned into believing, right? As you grow up, you're like, yeah, little Jimmy, that's a table. Don't run into it. If you close your eyes, it's still going to be there, right? It has an independent existence from you. Another way of putting this is Locke believes that regardless of our perceptions, our opinions, our beliefs, there are things out there in the world that have their own existences. If you close your eyes, Locke thinks the table is still there. If you died tonight, your stuffed animal would still be on your bed. It has its own existence. But Berkeley doesn't think so. And he uses a really interesting thought experiment to try to show this to us. What we might call his famous tree thought experiment. All right, everybody, close your eyes. We're going to do the thought experiment together. Close your eyes. No peeking. Imagine a tree. All right, have you imagined the tree? Picture a tree. Say yes if you've imagined the tree.
Yes.
Okay, now open your eyes. Remember what you imagined. Will somebody draw the tree on the board? What you pictured in your mind? Here, I'll draw what I pictured first. How about that? I pictured this. All right, now what did y'all picture? Somebody come draw it. Yeah, come on up. Here, you want black? Red?
Whatever.
Here, go with red. Red's cool. All right, what did you picture? Draw it up on the board.
The big willow tree.
Oh, cool. So you pictured a different kind of tree. That's nice.
I don't know how to draw it. But
Willows are cool. Yeah, perfect. Did anybody else picture something different? Did anybody picture a tree from the top down? You're looking at it like a bird, and you kind of see this, just looking down on it. Anybody picture that? Some people sometimes do. Now, what does this thought experiment show? Well, Berkeley thinks it shows something very strange and interesting. According to Locke's view, there are objects out there that have their own existence, independent of our perception. But Berkeley thinks we can't know that. We can't even show that. We can't demonstrate it. Try to imagine a tree unperceived. Can you do it? You're like, yeah, I see it right there. If you're imagining it, you're perceiving it. If you're thinking about it, you're perceiving the thing. If you're reflecting on it, you're perceiving it. Berkeley says we cannot imagine an object unperceived. And so we can't make this claim that there are objects out there whose existences are independent of our perception of them. He's very famous for bringing up the following example. If a tree falls in the forest and nobody is around to hear it, does it make a sound? Many of you would say yes, right? But he would say, how the hell do you know? How could you know that? Nobody was around to evaluate whether it made a sound or not. So we cannot imagine an object unperceived. We sneak in a perceiver, if we do. And Berkeley thinks this shows something very interesting about the relationship between our perception and the things we call objects. In other words, we cannot imagine or think about or conceive an object who has an existence independent of our perception. Sorry, trees, you're going to have to go. And so what does this mean? Somehow the existence of a thing and our perception of it are inseparable. You cannot imagine a chair in a room that is unperceived. If you do, you're perceiving it, you're imagining it. You cannot conceive of a planet out there unperceived with its own independent existence. If you do, you're perceiving it. Does that make sense? Thus, we cannot prove that there are objects out there in the world that exist independently of our consciousness.
You said this guy is Christian?
Yes.
So this contradicts like the fact that there is a God, because no one can think of God.
You don't think God's perceiving himself?
Well, like we can't actually know what God looks like because we've never seen him.
Well, sure, we haven't, but we're not the masters of the universe, right? Maybe you've had a religious experience. Wouldn't that be a perception of God? I don't know. But yeah, good question.
I think it's a perception of God, but
yeah.
it's just something else.
Right. You have an idea. You have a perception. How do you know it's accurately representative of this thing called God? Yeah.
I was just wondering, so like, what is an essence, if not empty?
What? Oh. Well, Plato thought they were ideas, but not in the way you think of an idea. See, when we think of the word idea, we think of something subjective, unreal, existing only in the mind. The word that Plato uses, eidos, idea, he doesn't think it's unreal, that it exists only in the mind. He thinks it exists in this realm that we can't access, called the realm of the forms, where these perfect universal essences exist. And a lot of people believe some version of that. Because how else would you know what a table looks like unless you're somehow perceiving that it has the essence of that thing called tableness? But Berkeley's trying to blow that up here. Right? He's like, no, you only have unique perceptions of all these unique things. This idea that they all belong to the category of table is just a mental abstraction.
So he doesn't believe that there is, like, an essence to them?
No, not really. No, we just have our unique perceptions and ideas of all these things.
What about some people, though?
Ah, that's a better question. Let me answer that in a few minutes. So, somehow the existence of a thing and our perception of it always go together. They're inseparable. Thus, we cannot prove that Locke's picture is right. We cannot prove there are objects out there existing independently of us. But he takes it a step further. What do you think makes up this table? What does science say makes up this table? Atoms. What's the M word for all that physical stuff? Matter. So what people think is, look, the objects out there are made of this thing called matter, this fundamental substance, this physical substance thing. Riddle me this. Have you ever seen matter? Have you ever felt matter? Smelled matter? Tasted matter? No. What the hell would that be like? Nobody has ever seen or tasted or smelled or touched or heard matter, this thing that we think makes up all the stuff in our surroundings. Nobody's ever experienced that. That's just a mental abstraction. I could just as easily say there is this underlying substance called splunko that makes up all of this around your heads. Splunko. But we don't think there's a splunko, right? Why would we think there's this thing called matter? Nobody's experienced it, really. Have they? So matter is just an abstraction. He doesn't even think that matter exists. We have no basis on empiricism to think that. Nobody has ever experienced that. This word just refers to a mental construction. It doesn't refer to anything that we've actually experienced.
I thought they have done experiments where they could prove like atoms, like when they like the whole laser. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, we have evidence that atoms exist. Yeah. We've seen atoms with microscopes, right, and experiments. But have you seen matter? What the hell is that? So we say that atoms are made up of matter, this underlying thing, but nobody's ever experienced that, Berkeley's saying. He's like, all you Enlightenment folks are getting lost in these weird mental abstractions. This idea of matter is like an occult belief. You just have faith that there's this underlying substance that makes up all the objects around you. But if we follow empiricism, we don't have any good reason for thinking matter, this underlying fundamental thing nobody's ever seen, exists. And then he blows our world apart. Not only can we not prove that there are objects out there existing independently of us, not only can we not prove that matter exists, Berkeley says, if you're being logical, if you're being reasonable, what you should come to believe is that really everything that exists is just a mind or an idea. That's what all this stuff is. It's either a mind or an idea. Because remember, all you have access to are ideas. That's the only thing that you're dealing with. The only thing that you're turning around in your minds, reflecting on, are ideas, sensations, perceptions. This view is known as absolute idealism. In contrast to dualism, which says that there are two fundamental substances which make up everything in the universe, matter and mental stuff, Berkeley's going to say, throw that matter crap out. We can't prove it exists. We've never experienced it. All that's left is ideas, minds, mental things. So, idealism is the view that the universe is made up of minds and ideas and nothing else. In other words, one fundamental substance makes up everything in the world, and that is mental stuff. This is what we call in metaphysics a monistic view. The view that everything is made up of one underlying thing. So, that's what all this stuff is at bottom. This is an idea. This is an idea. That's an idea. He's not saying any of this is less real. He's just saying what you thought it was, it's not what you thought it was. All this stuff is real, right? If you walk forward, you're going to bump into the wall. But the wall is not a material thing. It's an idea. What objects are, these things that we call objects, they're just bundles of perceptions, bundles of qualities. To suppose that they're made up of this thing called matter and exist independently of us, that's a logical leap we can't make. Tables, chairs, computers, they're just bundles of perceptions. Now, if you're following along, you're going to have a few questions. Does that mean everything that we see around us exists like only in our minds? Is everything just relative to our own minds? How could that be the case? We all see the same thing when we look at this, right? We all see the same thing when we look at this. You all hear the same thing when I do this. So if everything is just in the mind, what could possibly explain the fact that we have similar experiences when we encounter these things? Well, Berkeley has an explanation for that. And it has to do with his faith and his belief in Christianity. If we compare Berkeley and Locke, we might say the following. according to Locke, perception is a pretty passive thing, right? Ideas are formed in your mind by objects out there. You just take in stimuli, you take in sensations, and somehow your mind forms a picture. It's not as if your perception makes the thing what it is. It's the other way around. The way that the thing is, according to Locke, determines your perception. So we might say, looking at it through one lens, Locke implies perception is passive. Our minds are not constructing the reality we see around us. Our minds are just informed about what's already there. Objects produce ideas in us. But let me ask you this. If you accept Locke's view, and this table is made of matter, so is the chair, so is all that, and somehow that is different from your mind is made up of this other substance, it's this other thing, different in kind. Given the fact that tables and chairs and rocks don't have minds, how the hell could they produce ideas, immaterial things in us? How does that work? How could something material produce something in you that's immaterial? If these are two fundamentally different things. We can make sense of, these things colliding and causally affecting one another because they're both material, right? A physical thing, when it touches another physical thing, transfers energy to it. That's how we think physical things work. But how the heck can a physical thing cause some sort of immaterial thing to form in here? Berkeley's like, that doesn't make sense. Objects cannot produce ideas. Objects don't have ideas. Objects don't have minds. Right? Tables and chairs and rocks and floors don't have minds. What produces ideas? You already know the answer. Just imagine something you've never imagined before. What do you think produces ideas?
I'm probably so wrong, but just our minds.
Yeah, consciousness produces ideas. Yes, exactly. Yes. Somehow, our perception, our consciousness, takes a more active role in reality than what Locke implies. Perception is not passive. It's more active than Locke thinks it is. It's consciousness that produces ideas. That's the only thing that can produce ideas. Rocks don't have ideas. Rocks don't have perceptions. Consciousness produces ideas. Consciousness has perceptions. Minds, you could say. But the problem that we raised is still on the table. When we look at this table, your experience of the table is not random, right? You see the same thing that I see. You see the same shape. You see the same color, probably. Right? When you get hit by a car, you have the same sensation and pain if I get hit by a car going at the same speed, right? But given that we all have our own unique consciousnesses, how and why is it that our sensations are so similar, our experiences are so similar, that we can actually even talk about and communicate this stuff at all? The answer for Berkeley is God. God is the ultimate cause of all ideas. The historian Darren Staloff says, God is the universal switchboard for ideas. And what he means by that is somehow what God is doing for us is He's making you have the same perception of this that I'm having. God is guaranteeing somehow that our perceptions are not random, that we have similar experiences. In part because God created all of this, he thinks. God created all of this, and through His operations and through His craftsmanship has baked certain fundamental laws about how perception works into the universe. That's why our perceptions aren't random. That's why we have the same experiences and we can talk about this stuff. God is making it so. There's a certain regularity, a certain order, a certain similarity between our experiences because God is making it so. So everything that you see around you, God has His hand in that. God made this stuff. God is making it now so that you have a certain perception when you look at the table. When I speak to you and those words form a certain idea in your minds, God is making it so that information can be transmitted and we can actually communicate. You don't hear my words like blah, 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 blah. Right? You hear a language that you understand and you have a certain experience and it's sensible to you. God is making that happen. So God is the ultimate cause of reality, of all the ideas that we have. And God baked into the universe certain laws about how ideas and perceptions are formed and perceived by minds, which we call the laws of nature.
So if God has the ability and power to make everyone see eye to eye on all ideas, then why is it that, like, in politics, so many people aren't able to come to similar conclusions?
Why would there be differences in our perception?
Yeah.
Because God wants there to be? I don't know.
But because of that, so many people die.
Yeah?
And there's so much awful things because we don't see eye to eye on so many different things.
Well, you know what the typical Christian answer to that is? The reason why there's evil and sin and all this terrible shit in the world is because humans are not doing what they're supposed to do. And then you could say, well, God's allowing it to happen, so it's His fault. But then there's another argument that we could go into.
So he doesn't believe in essence. But what is God? Like,
Well,
is God
okay.
in the other, is God in essence?
He doesn't believe that. He believes that the names that we attach to things are just mental abstractions. But there is something out there that's God. And there is your unique mind. There are all these different things. But the words and the categories that we invoke are just mental constructions. So there are unique things, right? This is its own thing. This is its own thing. You're your own thing. God is his own thing. In reality, there are a multiplicity of things. It's just that the language and the concepts that we use to describe and talk about that stuff is just how we have split up the world and what we decided. We could have called this a Bargelwarf, you know? Yeah, right? We could have. This is actually an argument that you see a lot in contemporary politics, right? That everything is a social construction. Berkeley's saying something similar about the words and the concepts and the categories. It's like we've created that stuff to make sense of the world that God has placed us in, but perhaps there is no necessary connection between the word table and that thing.
So I know you said it was like a Christian.
Yes.
But is this like, because everyone has their own perception, like everyone has their own perception of God. Like, is this what started like the conversation of like the simulation theory and things like that?
Well, this view, this idealistic view, certainly was picked up by others, and yeah, might cause them to think that this is all fake or a simulation and stuff. It's a very similar view to simulation theory. Yeah, but I don't know if there is if we can trace that, oh yeah, this guy got it from this guy, and then eventually it flowered into this. I don't know that complete story. So, God's created everything that you see around you. God makes it so that we have similar experiences. The hand of God is in how we perceive and sense things. It's not random. This is Berkeley's view. We can't prove matter exists. We can't prove there are objects out there independent of our perception of them. So, using Occam's razor, have you all heard of this phrase? It's a tool that was developed by this guy named, I think it's Willem of Occam, who said, if you have two explanations and they both equally describe the world equally well, and one of them has more premises or more assumptions, you take the other one. You take the one with less premises, less assumptions. Berkeley thinks this makes more sense out of reality than the scientific view of his day, largely because the scientific view, the Enlightenment view, is that there's this thing called matter that exists, and he's like, no, nobody knows that. Nobody can show that. That's an unnecessary assumption. We don't need to invoke matter in order to make sense out of all this stuff and how life works and what's going on.
I still don't know how you can prove God, though, over, you can't prove God just as much as you can't prove matter.
Right, maybe we would have to say, just as the thinkers in his day Berkeley is criticizing have a faith in matter, Berkeley has a faith that God exists. Similarly, if you're really scrutinizing what's going on here, you would say, Berkeley, you're making a logical leap here. You've demonstrated we can't prove that matter exists, but now you're saying definitively there's no such thing. It doesn't exist. That's a leap, right? How could we know that? So you could criticize him for that as well.
So really he's biased towards God and Christianity.
I suppose you could phrase it like that. Yeah, he's a Christian. He's a bishop,
Okay, yeah, back then. But that's not fair to the rest of the people who believe it because they'll believe that God is the only answer and we should
He's not against science. He just thinks science is amazing. Observation and hypothesis and experimentation is cool, and it can do awesome things and change society and build all this technology for us. He just thinks that it's built on faulty assumptions, like matter. So he doesn't want to say science is bad, never use science, never trust science. He's just going to say, at the bottom of this scientific worldview are these things that are unjustifiable. He loves science. He just thinks that they're a little wrong about some things, about their fundamental axioms. Berkeley thinks this idealistic view can make sense out of everything that we care about and that we can know. That's why he's attracted to it, and that's why he's putting forth arguments for it. He thinks that his view can explain everything at the time that they were looking at, without invoking any of the unjustifiable views that science was doing, he thought. And there's something really cool about this philosophy too. This is a deep problem that we're not going to talk a lot about in this class, but it's one that you will investigate if you continue on reading the history of philosophy, Locke, Descartes, Kant specifically. Notice what's going on in this picture. There is a gap between what exists out there and what we think we know. Between what we would call noumena, the things in themselves, and phenomena, as it is represented in our mind. If you hold this view, how can you ever know for certain that your ideas accurately represent what's going on out there? Berkeley doesn't think that you can if you hold Locke's view. But you can know what reality is like if it's all ideas, and that's all you're interacting with. There's no gap, because there are no objects outside of your perception. There's no distance that has to be crossed there. You're just sensing things. You're just perceiving things. So do you see how that overcomes this problem? It's a cool solution to this deep problem that philosophers are still wrestling with. Because as long as you suppose that there are things in themselves and then there are our minds that are perceiving them, you have to try to explain or justify how you could know what any of this stuff is and what it is like. So he tries to bridge the gap between noumena and phenomena. And he thinks that this worldview, this metaphysical view, makes sense. It makes the most sense and has the least amount of assumptions. The least amount of unnecessary assumptions. Any questions? It's a weird view. Very strange. We're not used to thinking like this. But it is a view that you can hold. In fact, my undergraduate advisor had a student once who, after the lecture on Berkeley, came up to him a few days later and said, "I agree completely with him. I'm dropping out of school. I'm done here. I've got it." So this is a view that you can have, okay? And it's a view that has been written on and explored and justified and argued for in a myriad of ways. Don't just toss it out because you think it sounds crazy, okay? Because a lot of these arguments that he's making are really good. Yeah?
Oh no, I was just agreeing, yeah.
Okay. So this is one monistic view you could have. You could think that everything in the universe is made up of mental stuff. But there's a flip side to that as well. What's the flip side? Instead of mental stuff, what could you think makes up everything? It's this word we've been throwing around all class. Matter, exactly. Yes, which is why I asked you to do 2 readings today. Because one of them says Ideas and minds make everything up, and the other one says, no, actually matter makes everything up. And this is what we might call the contemporary scientific view. The contemporary scientific view is another monistic philosophy. It's an amalgamation of a bunch of different views. It's what we would call naturalistic. Can anybody guess what this view says? It's a view about the nature of reality. Naturalism. What would you call a spirit or a ghost? Not a natural thing, but a supernatural thing, exactly. Berkeley believes in supernatural things, namely God. Descartes also believed, you might say, in supernatural things. A lot of people nowadays believe in supernatural things like spirits, ghosts, demons, angels, God, Satan. Naturalism just says, nah, bro. It's the view that all that exists is natural or a product of nature. No supernatural things exist. So, we might say it's the view that everything in the universe is nature or a product of nature. Atoms and waves and molecules and photons and energy, all the biological, chemical, physical processes that are going on in your body, it's natural stuff. It's just natural stuff. The contemporary scientific view thinks everything is natural. It's either a part or product of nature. Similarly, this view thinks that everything is made of matter or physical stuff. This is a slightly different view than naturalism, because if we just say this, well, we can say, well, what is that? What is nature? Well, you might think nature is just matter. Matter arranged in different ways. This is what's known as materialism. It's the view that everything in the universe is made up of matter. Things like atoms and molecules and waves and all that stuff. And the general story for what all this is and how all this got here is this. According to the contemporary scientific view, the Big Bang created our universe. At some point, life arose somewhere on Earth due to chemical and biological reactions and evolved to what we see today. So the contemporary scientific view is naturalistic, materialistic, and insofar as it invokes evolution, we might say neo-Darwinian. It's based on this idea that life evolves through natural selection. the characteristics that a life form has are products of life forms trying to adapt to their environment, and the best surviving ones that can reproduce won out and have propagated their genes on into the future. And consequently, we don't need God or religion to explain to us how the universe works. We don't need God to explain any of this. Is this a view that y'all like better than idealism? Does this make more sense? It certainly seems to be what a lot of our intellectuals nowadays believe. Y'all like it?
I feel like it's logical in a lot of ways, but at the same time, it is scary to think that that's just what this is, because
Why is it scary?
because it reduces like all human experience to just science, and then it also doesn't give us a reason to believe there's anything after this.
Or it doesn't give us any evidence or reason to believe in an afterlife?
Yeah.
And that's scary for people? Sure.
Well, I think like the biggest part of living is like the search for meaning, and like if there is one. And I think when we reduce it down to just like existence with no meaning, then it becomes kind of empty.
So going along with this view, there's this idea that you weren't created for a reason. Your life doesn't have an objective purpose. There's no objective meaning or reason that you're here. And you think for a lot of people that's upsetting, and they want to hang on to that, and they're like, I don't know, like that seems important and necessary. Yeah, that's fair. Yes?
I do think it's just really frustrating because after looking at both, neither make complete sense.
Okay.
So it's like, it could be like down to like a combination between the two, but like, I don't know.
So something more like a dualism that Descartes put forth?
Yeah, maybe, but I don't know.
Well, how about this? Let me ask you this one. If we're all just made up of atoms, molecules, there are chemical reactions and physical reactions and neural reactions going on in our bodies, and all these things are just following the laws of nature, does anybody have free will? Or do you just think and say what your body and brain makes you think and say? Can you control the chemical reactions in your brain? Feel happy. Oh, there I go. This is a deep problem. A lot of people think that this view implies that free will does not exist. There's no such thing as free will. That's an illusion we tell ourselves. If there's no free will, what does that imply? Tell me, if we're both walking down the street and we're going along in our merry way and all of a sudden a gust of wind blows me into you and I knock you down, am I morally at fault there? Can you blame me morally for knocking you down? A lot of people would say no, right? That was an accident. I didn't make the wind happen. I didn't mean for that to happen. Well, if there's no free will and nobody has any control over what they do, how can anybody be morally responsible for anything? And then if nobody's morally responsible for anything, what does that say about our legal system and our criminal justice system and the fact that we lock people up. All of a sudden it looks like that's unfair too. Because look, the serial killer, he couldn't control his actions. It's unfair to judge him and persecute him and lock him up when he couldn't control what he was doing. So maybe punishing people and putting them in prison is unjustifiable. Can't do that. There's actually a philosopher who argues that because there's no free will and because there's no moral responsibility, what that implies is we should make prisons as fun as possible. Give them Xboxes and ice creams because it's not their fault that they're there. They just got a bad role, a bad hand. The philosopher who created this idea called it punishment. We should engage in punishment, not punishment. Punishment's not fair because they don't deserve the punishment because they didn't have control over what they did. Their brain just made them do that.
Also, like, if nothing matters because there is nothing after this, then that also causes a huge issue because people who believe in God don't do terrible, well, not all people, but most times what drives people to not do terrible things is the fear of going to hell.
Sure, yeah.
So
if we all lost,
Yeah.
if we lost belief in the idea that people are morally responsible, yeah, do you think society would get better or get worse? Yeah.
it would be like a purge.
That's actually another thing that the same author argues in a different article. He says, we can't let the lay people learn this. This is knowledge only the philosophers and scientists should have. Because otherwise, society is going to devolve into chaos. One more implication, and then I'll let you go. If it's true that we're just made of atoms, we're just evolutionarily evolved organisms, what does that imply about your mental life? You have desires and beliefs and longings and emotion and hopes and dreams. What is all that stuff ultimately on this view? Just chemical reactions. Neurons firing. What is love? That's just neuron 12A firing to 34B. That's all it is. Same thing for your desires and your beliefs. It's just a set of neurons firing in a certain way. Electricity moving through your brain, certain neurotransmitters being released. That's it. So we might say on this view, it implies we actually have a really shallow mental life. Love is just a chemical reaction. That's all it is. So, now maybe you can see why people are attracted to idealism and dualism. Because no view is without its problems. No view is without its weaknesses. So, I would caution you against just dismissing a lot of the views that we're going to look at in class. Because all of the views that we're looking at have their pros and cons, their strengths and their weaknesses. If you want to get to the bottom of things, you got to think about this stuff. Like, really reflect on it. It's not obvious to me from where I'm standing and all of the 15 years of research that I have done that any one of these is obviously true. But that's just me. Okay. Any questions, concerns, comments? All right. Well, I'll let you go then. I hope you found this interesting, enlightening. Go tell your friends they're just living in the mind of God. That's all this is. Ideas in the mind of God.